I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at Logic's multiband compressor. Most of the time that we're changing the dynamic range of sounds, we're working on a sound by sound basis. We're effectively saying, okay, I'm going to take my drum loop and add some compression to that, or a synth part or a vocal. But when it comes to processing a number of sounds at once, what we've got is a whole range of different frequency areas all being busy at the same time. Lots of sounds coming together, providing us with bass and mid-range and top end. And sometimes what we want to do is to make different compression choices based on different frequency groups. In other words, what might sound good from a compression point of view at the bass end of a mix might be very different to what sounds good from a compression point of view at the top end of a mix. And what multiband compressors allow us to do is to break sounds or groups of tracks down into different frequency bands so that we can then add different compression settings to those different bands. And in particular, multiband compression works very nicely on the output channel. I'll show you what I mean. What we've got here is a track, and we're just going to hear that before we go any further. So what we've got here is a beat loop and a synth and some top end percussion, this really fizzy hi-hat part, and then another more muted synth, which is a little bit in the distance. So we've got lots of treble and lots of mid-range and lots of bass. Now what I'm going to do is to add the multiband compressor, which is available from within the Dynamics folder. And I'm going to add that. It's called the Multipressor. I'm going to add that to the output channel, and we're just going to pop its interface over here on the right-hand side. And in fact, we'll close the mixer down so we can see this processor a little bit more clearly. So what I can see is that I've got 4 separate frequency bands. This one corresponds to the bass. This is kind of low mid-range. This is upper mid-range into the sort of treble, and then this is really high frequency content. So what I can do is to add different compression settings to each of these different bands. Now, multiband compression can be really confusing when you first open up a multiband compressor for the first time. And one thing that can help is to identify, first of all, exactly what those different frequency bands sound like. And the multipressor makes that easy for us because what we can do is to solo each band in turn. So if I want to hear this sort of second band, I can press the solo button, and when I press play, we're only going to hear the frequencies that exist within that band. So that's working nicely. What we can do then is to actually have a look around the interface to see exactly which frequencies we're listening to at this point. So firstly, I can see that this band number 2, exists here. And I can see from the display above that effectively what we're doing here is we're looking at these individual crossover points between bands. You can see that as I move these, I'm changing this number. This is where band number 1 becomes band number 2. So if I actually want this to be the kind of low mid-range area, what I might do is to sort of set my sort of low frequency at around 140 Hertz, and I might pull this one much closer into the sort of low mid-range, even sort of, this isn't quite low mid-range yet, but nevertheless, we're making a much narrower band here. And as a result, what we can do is to go looking for the kind of engine room of the track, the bit that's driving in this low mid-range and providing some purpose to it. Okay, so the next thing is to start thinking about the compression values that I want to use for this individual band. What compressors allow us to do is to set a threshold point, the point above which compression starts, and then a ratio, how hard we're going to squeeze the dynamics above that point. Well, my compression threshold is here. So as I drop this, and you can see it changing within the display, what I'm then able to do is to set the point at which I want compression to begin. And then what I can do is to start thinking about how hard I want to push the compressor within that particular frequency area. So we can see that beginning to work now as well. I've also got attack and release times for this particular band here. And if I decide that having squeezed the dynamics quite hard here, that suddenly we're losing a lot of volume compared to the frequency bands, which we'll open up and hear again in a moment, what we can do is obviously produce a gain change as well. Having identified that group of frequencies and squashed its dynamics, I can turn up its overall volume, and I can do that here simply by clicking on the volume line for this individual band and turning up its individual gain makeup. So in other words, this setting here is showing me that I'm adding 2 decibels of volume to this frequency band. Now, so far, we've been auditioning this individual frequency area in solo mode, so not hearing it with the other frequency groups around it, just hearing it by itself. It's definitely time for us to reintroduce those other frequency bands and beginning to think a little bit about how we might change their individual dynamics to pull out the individual components of the mix that we're interested in. So I'm going to turn off solo mode, and what I'm going to do is just spend a couple of minutes identifying and auditioning different frequency bands and making different multi-band compression choices for those. So what we've done very quickly is to go through all 4 bands, and we've made some choices about compression thresholds and ratios and individual makeup gains. Now, it's always a good idea to A/B this. In other words, listen to the original dry signal, which we can do simply by bypassing this plugin altogether and then punching it in to hear the difference. So what we've got is a much more solid low end. You can hear in particular the bass drum, if you're listening on nice speakers, you'll hear that the bass drum is much more rounded and full now. But what I've also done is to pull out that kind of insistent little tone that's happening from this instrument, which is happening at the beginning of every bar. And it's just the space around that we've added a little bit more to, whilst at the same time reducing the top end of that hi-hat line. Now, obviously, the bigger and more complicated your mix, the more it's beneficial to split the individual components of your mix up into different frequency bands and compress them with slightly different settings. And as we've seen in this video, the Multipressor will let you do that.